It was just another sunny afternoon in a quiet town. But for Sarah, it was a day she'd never forget. As she walked down the main street, her two loyal military dogs trotted beside her. They were a perfect team, trained to respond to her every command without hesitation. The town was known for its friendly atmosphere, but today, Sarah could feel a different energy in the air as she passed by a group of bikers gathered outside a local bar. They were loud, laughing, and boasting to anyone who would listen, but as Sarah and her dogs approached, their attention shifted. At first, Sarah didn't mind. She had been used to the stares and whispers ever since she became a K9 handler. People had always looked at her a little differently, maybe because she was a woman working with military dogs, or maybe because she had the kind of presence that made people think she was tougher than she appeared. But this time, something felt off. One of the bikers, a tall man with a leather vest and a mischievous grin, took a step forward and called out to her. "Hey there, sweetheart," he shouted, his voice full of mockery. "I didn't know they let women handle real dogs. Are you sure you can keep up with these beasts?" The group laughed in unison, their mocking tones floating through the air. Sarah didn't flinch. Her dogs, a fierce German shepherd named Max and a well-trained Belgian Malinois called Diesel, stood by her side, their ears perked up, aware of the tension in the air. Sarah took a deep breath, keeping her composure. She had faced worse. Plenty of men had underestimated her before. Some didn't believe a woman could train military dogs to the level she had. But she didn't need to prove herself to anyone. The dogs she worked with spoke for themselves. Still, it was hard not to feel the sting of their words. "Is there something funny about military dogs?" Sarah asked calmly, turning to face the group of bikers. Another biker, wearing sunglasses despite the bright afternoon sun, stepped forward. He looked Sarah up and down, sizing her up in a way that made her feel uncomfortable. "You look a little out of place, don't you? What's a girl like you doing with dogs like these? You sure they're not just for show?" The group erupted into laughter again, clearly enjoying themselves. But Sarah remained stoic, her expression unchanged. She could see the doubt in their eyes. They thought she was weak. They thought her dogs were just pets, nothing more than animals to entertain the crowd. But what they didn't understand was that Max and Diesel weren't just any dogs. They were military dogs, trained for everything from search and rescue to high-risk operations. "Why don't you back off and leave her alone?" A quiet voice suddenly called out from the side. Sarah glanced to see a young man, one of the local bystanders, stepping forward. He wasn't trying to get involved in the confrontation, but it was clear he didn't like the way the bikers were treating her. The bikers just laughed again, clearly not expecting anyone to defend Sarah. "What's the matter, kid?" One of them sneered. "You gonna take her side?" But Sarah, sensing that things could escalate quickly, placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "It's all right," she said softly, turning her attention back to the bikers. "You don't need to get involved." The dogs, as if understanding the situation, moved a little closer to Sarah, standing by her side in perfect formation. They knew she had everything under control. But the bikers weren't done yet. One of them, clearly the leader, leaned against his bike and gave her a challenging look. "You think you can handle us, sweetheart?" he said with a smirk. "We don't take kindly to being disrespected, especially by someone like you." Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before they would push her too far. But she wasn't the kind of person to get angry. Instead, she was calm and collected, ready to teach them a lesson they wouldn't forget. She glanced at Max and Diesel, who were still waiting for her command, and then she turned her attention back to the bikers, unfazed by their taunts. "You'll find out just how wrong you are," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady and full of confidence. The bikers looked at each other, exchanging unsure glances. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to learn a harsh lesson about underestimating someone, and especially about underestimating a woman with the loyalty and power of her military dogs at her side. The bikers stood around Sarah, their laughter slowly dying down as they realized she wasn't going to back down. She had an air of quiet confidence that made them uneasy, but they still didn't take her seriously. Mike, the biggest and loudest of the bikers, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles with a grin that revealed his teeth. "All right, sweetheart, if you're so tough, let's see what your dogs can really do," he said, his voice full of mockery. "How about a little competition? You and your dogs against us. Let's see who's really got the skills here." The other bikers, clearly amused by Mike's challenge, cheered him on. They thought it would be a joke, a simple contest to prove that they were stronger, faster, and tougher than Sarah and her dogs. Sarah knew they were underestimating her, underestimating everything her military dogs had been trained to do. She glanced down at Max and Diesel, who were still standing at attention, waiting for her next move. She could tell they were more than ready for whatever challenge lay ahead. They had been through tougher situations in their training, and this would be no different. "You want a challenge," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "Fine, but it's not going to be what you expect." She stood tall, her eyes locking with Mike's, showing no sign of fear. "This isn't just a game. My dogs don't play. They've been trained to do things you couldn't even dream of. So if you want to test them, be prepared." Mike smirked, clearly thinking that Sarah's words were just empty talk. "All right, let's make it interesting," he said, turning to the others. "You heard her. Let's see if these so-called military dogs can keep up with us. We'll set up a little competition. Strength, speed, and agility. And maybe, just maybe, we'll see what these dogs are really made of." He pointed to one of the bikers who was holding a set of weights nearby. "First up, let's see how well your dogs can keep up with us in a race. We'll time it, and if your dogs are faster, we'll call it even. But if they lose, then we win." The challenge seemed simple enough. A race. But Sarah knew that her dogs weren't just trained for speed. They were trained to react, to think under pressure, and to execute complex commands that went far beyond what these bikers could understand. She nodded slowly, accepting the challenge. "All right," Sarah said, "we'll race. But don't think this is just about speed. You're going to have to do more than run fast to beat my dogs." Mike and the others exchanged amused glances. They had no idea what they were about to face. Sarah signaled to her dogs, who immediately fell into line beside her. Max, the German shepherd, was known for his incredible endurance, and Diesel, the Belgian Malinois, was quick and agile, able to change direction on a dime. Sarah watched as the bikers revved their engines, ready to race their motorcycles down the open road. She wasn't worried about the motorcycles. Max and Diesel had been trained to chase down anything, even at high speeds. The real challenge would be getting the dogs to focus on the task at hand. The countdown began, and Sarah stood still, her eyes locked on the finish line. She gave a quick nod to Max and Diesel, and the dogs immediately began to move, their bodies flowing like water, their movements in perfect synchronization. The bikers took off first, their motorcycles roaring to life as they sped down the road. But it didn't take long before the dogs started gaining ground. Max's legs were powerful, and Diesel's speed was unmatched. They raced past the bikers, who were now looking over their shoulders in shock. The dogs weren't just keeping up. They were pulling ahead, closing the gap between them and the motorcycles at a remarkable speed. Sarah kept her pace steady, knowing that the dogs could handle the rest. The bikers' faces turned from smugness to disbelief as the dogs pulled ahead. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. No one had ever expected Sarah's dogs to be faster than their motorcycles, and now they were witnessing it firsthand. Max and Diesel didn't slow down. They were in full pursuit, determined to win the race no matter what. As the finish line approached, the bikers were left in the dust. They couldn't match the dogs' endurance and speed. Sarah gave the signal, and the dogs surged forward one last time, crossing the finish line before the bikers had even completed half of their race. The crowd was silent. Even the bikers who had been mocking Sarah just moments ago were speechless. They couldn't believe they had been beaten by a pair of dogs, and the realization hit them hard. Sarah stood there, proud but calm, watching her dogs panting happily at her side. Mike, who had been so sure of his victory, was left speechless. He couldn't understand how it had happened. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, staring at the dogs, unable to accept what had just occurred. The bikers stood frozen, still trying to process what had just happened. Their motorcycles, which had once seemed like the ultimate symbol of strength, were now irrelevant compared to the incredible speed and agility of Sarah's dogs. The dogs had finished the race before the bikers had even reached the halfway point, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. Mike, the leader of the group, stood there, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. His hands were still gripping the handlebars of his motorcycle, but the joy and cocky attitude he had carried moments ago had completely faded. He glanced at Sarah, and for the first time, he looked at her with respect, not mockery. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered under his breath. "Guess I didn't see that coming." He shook his head, still trying to understand how the race had played out. The other bikers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. They had all expected to be the ones to win, but Sarah's dogs had completely turned the tables. Sarah, on the other hand, remained calm, her face betraying nothing. She had known all along that her dogs were more than capable of handling whatever challenge the bikers threw at them. Max and Diesel had been trained for high-stakes situations, and racing was just one of many skills they possessed. She could see the bikers' egos slowly deflating, and a small part of her felt a sense of satisfaction. But there was more to the challenge than just the race. She wasn't done yet. "You guys look surprised," Sarah said, her voice carrying an edge of amusement. "I told you, this wasn't going to be just about speed." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. "Let's see what else you've got." Mike, his pride now wounded, stepped forward again, his confidence shaken but not broken. "All right, we get it. Your dogs are fast. But let's see if they can handle a real challenge. How about we put them through an agility test? We'll see if they're just fast, or if they actually have the skills to back it up." The other bikers nodded in agreement, trying to regain some of their lost pride. They had underestimated Sarah, but they weren't ready to give up just yet. They needed to prove that they could beat her and her dogs in some way, anyway. Sarah raised an eyebrow. She knew that this would be another easy win for Max and Diesel. Agility was one of their strongest suits. They were trained to navigate complex courses, dodge obstacles, and work together as a team. It was a skill they had mastered in the military, where the stakes were always high, and every movement had to be precise. "I'm up for it," Sarah said, her tone firm. "But don't say I didn't warn you. My dogs are built for this." The bikers set up a makeshift obstacle course right in the middle of the street. It wasn't much, just a few cones, some barrels, and a couple of low fences, but it was enough for what they had in mind. The bikers were eager to see if the dogs could navigate through the obstacles, but they were too busy focusing on the challenge to notice the quiet confidence in Sarah's eyes. Sarah took a few steps back, giving Max and Diesel plenty of space. She gave them a simple command, and immediately the dogs sprang into action. Max, the German Shepherd, was the first to take off. He darted around the cones, his body flowing smoothly through the narrow gaps, as if the obstacles weren't even there. Diesel, the Malinois, followed closely behind, her movements sharp and precise. She leaped over the low barriers with ease, never breaking her stride. The bikers watched in amazement as the dogs completed the course in mere seconds, each movement fluid and controlled. It was clear that the dogs weren't just following commands. They were anticipating what was coming next, reacting with perfect timing. The bikers, who had been so sure that they could find some weakness in the dogs, were left speechless. Mike looked down at the ground, his shoulders slumping. He had expected to find some flaw, something he could use to win. But now, it was clear that there was nothing Sarah and her dogs couldn't handle. He turned to his friends, who were also looking at the dogs in awe. The excitement and bravado they had once shared were now gone, replaced with a quiet respect for the team in front of them. "Guess we underestimated you," Mike admitted, his voice low. He looked at Sarah, his earlier arrogance replaced with humility. "Your dogs. There's something else." Sarah nodded, her face softening slightly. She had already known that they would impress the bikers, but it was still satisfying to see the look on their faces. "I told you," she said, her voice calm but carrying a sense of finality. "My dogs aren't just pets. They're soldiers, and I'm not just their handler. We're a team." The bikers, now defeated in their challenge, nodded in understanding. They had learned. The bikers stood in stunned silence as Sarah and her dogs completed the agility course with ease. The air was thick with disbelief. Mike, who had been so sure that his crew could outdo Sarah and her canines, now seemed to be at a loss for words. He scratched the back of his head, looking at his friends for some kind of reassurance, but none came. They were all quietly processing what they had just seen. Sarah, calm as ever, took a step back from the obstacle course and looked down at Max and Diesel. The two dogs, who had been so perfectly synchronized throughout the entire challenge, now stood by her side, their tails wagging happily. It was as though they knew they had just proven their worth, and now they were simply waiting for their next task. "All right, that was impressive," Mike finally said, his voice a little shaky. "But we've got one last challenge in mind." The other bikers murmured their agreement. They had come here hoping to put Sarah and her dogs in their place, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the dogs were more than just well-trained pets. They were a force to be reckoned with. Still, Mike wasn't ready to give up. He was determined to find some way to beat them. Sarah raised an eyebrow. She had been expecting more, but it seemed that the bikers were reluctant to admit defeat. "What do you have in mind?" she asked, her tone steady. Mike took a step forward, a new idea forming in his mind. "How about this? You've shown us speed and agility, but we want to see if your dogs can really handle pressure. We'll bring in something they've never seen before. Let's see how they react when it's not just a simple obstacle course." The bikers looked at each other, nodding. They were all eager to see if Sarah's dogs could handle a real challenge, something more unpredictable and intense. Sarah's eyes narrowed, sensing that this wasn't just another simple test. She knew that the bikers weren't going to make it easy for her and her dogs, but she wasn't worried. Max and Diesel had faced danger in the past, and they had always risen to the occasion. "All right," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "Bring it on. But don't say I didn't warn you." Mike smiled, his plan beginning to take shape. He signaled to one of the bikers, who then went to the back of their van and pulled out a large, intimidating-looking object. It was a massive metal chain, coiled tightly in his hands. The biker moved forward, dragging the heavy chain behind him, and Sarah's dogs immediately tensed, their senses alert. "What's this?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but tinged with curiosity. Mike grinned. "This, my friend, is a chain we use to tie down our bikes. It's heavy, it's strong, and it's definitely not something your dogs are used to." The bikers were all watching closely now, waiting to see if the dogs would back down or show any sign of fear. The chain was big and heavy, and it was clear that it wasn't going to be easy for the dogs to navigate. But Sarah didn't flinch. She knew what they were trying to do. They wanted to intimidate the dogs with something they weren't familiar with. They wanted to break their confidence, to show that the dogs had limits. But Sarah knew better. "Max, Diesel," she said in a firm, commanding voice. "Stay focused." Without hesitation, Max and Diesel stepped forward, their eyes never leaving the chain. They didn't show any sign of fear or hesitation. Instead, they moved carefully around the chain, sniffing it, inspecting it. It was as if they were trying to understand it, to figure out what it was and what it meant. Sarah smiled to herself, watching as her dogs circled the chain with curiosity but no fear. Max then nudged it with his nose, testing its weight, while Diesel followed suit. The bikers watched, amazed that the dogs didn't seem intimidated at all. They were reacting the way any well-trained dog would, with focus and caution, not with fear. The bikers had expected the dogs to be scared, to hesitate when they saw the heavy metal chain. But instead, they saw two military dogs, ready to tackle anything that came their way. The chain might have been foreign to them, but the dogs were used to working through obstacles, whether physical or mental. Impressive, Mike muttered, clearly surprised by how the dogs were handling the situation. Looks like we underestimated them after all. The rest of the bikers remained silent, watching with awe as the dogs continued to inspect the chain. They had expected the dogs to struggle, but now they were beginning to realize that they had no idea just how skilled these dogs really were. Sarah, sensing that the challenge had come to an end, gave her dogs the signal to back off. Max and Diesel immediately stopped their inspection, returning to her side. The bikers, who had been so sure of their own strength, now looked at Sarah with a newfound respect. The silence that followed was thick with tension. The bikers, still processing what had just happened, looked at each other but didn't speak. The challenge with the chain had been meant to push Sarah and her dogs to their limits, but instead it had backfired. Sarah stood there, calm and composed, her dogs at her side, while the bikers slowly realized they had underestimated her and her canines. Mike, the leader of the group, was the first to speak. His voice was quieter now, less sure of himself than before. "All right, I'll admit it. Your dogs are impressive, and I wasn't expecting them to handle that so well. But I think it's time to make this a little more interesting." Sarah raised an eyebrow. She had already proven her dog's skills in speed, agility, and their ability to stay calm under pressure. But she could sense that Mike was determined to keep testing her and her dogs, not willing to accept defeat just yet. "What do you have in mind now?" Sarah asked, her voice steady, though there was a hint of challenge in her tone. Mike smiled, but this time there was no cocky confidence in his expression. It was more of a thoughtful grin, as if he had come up with a plan that he believed would finally give him the edge. "You've shown us that your dogs are fast, and they're agile, but can they handle a real test of their strength and endurance? We'll set up a tug-of-war. We'll use one of the bikes and see if your dogs can pull it. If they can, I'll admit we've lost this challenge. But if they can't, well, you'll have to accept that you're not as tough as you think." The other bikers nodded in agreement. It was clear they were all eager to see if Sarah's dogs could handle something so physically demanding. Mike didn't expect them to succeed, and Sarah could see that he was counting on the strength of his bikes and the power of the bikers to win this one. Sarah looked at Max and Diesel, who were standing quietly by her side. The two dogs seemed to sense the challenge ahead, their muscles tensing slightly, as if ready to spring into action at her command. She knew they were capable of incredible strength. After all, they had been trained for search and rescue missions and had performed many feats of strength in the military. "All right," Sarah said, her tone calm and confident. "Let's do it. But remember, my dogs aren't just trained to pull. They're trained to work as a team." Mike nodded, looking pleased that Sarah had accepted the challenge. He gestured to one of the bikers, who moved toward the motorcycle with a long rope. They attached it to the rear wheel of the bike, and then they placed the other end of the rope in front of Sarah and her dogs. It was a simple setup, but it would test the strength and endurance of the dogs in a way the bikers hadn't yet seen. "Let's see if your dogs can pull that bike, then," Mike said, his voice tinged with amusement. Sarah gave a small nod, turning to Max and Diesel. She crouched down beside them, her voice low and calm as she gave the command. "All right, Max, Diesel, I need you to pull together. You've got this." At the sound of her voice, Max and Diesel immediately went into action. Their powerful legs braced against the ground, and they both dug in, pulling with everything they had. The rope tightened, and the bike began to move, slowly at first, but then picking up speed as the dogs worked together in perfect harmony. The bikers watched in stunned silence as Sarah's dogs continued to pull the heavy motorcycle with ease. Max, with his muscular frame, was powerful, while Diesel, though smaller, had incredible endurance. Together, they made quick work of the tug-of-war, pulling the bike several feet forward in mere seconds. Mike's jaw dropped. He had expected the dogs to struggle, but instead they were pulling with unmatched strength and determination. The other bikers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to react. They had never seen anything like this before. Sarah stood by, watching her dogs, a quiet sense of pride building in her chest. She knew they could do it. Max and Diesel had always been able to work together like this, relying on each other's strengths. The bond between them and Sarah was something that couldn't be broken by any challenge, no matter how difficult. Finally, after what seemed like no time at all, the bike had been pulled across the line. Sarah's dogs stopped immediately, panting but clearly not tired, as if they could have continued for much longer if they had needed to. Mike stood there, completely stunned. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by a genuine respect for Sarah and her dogs. He had come into this thinking he would easily prove that his strength and the power of his crew could outdo anything Sarah and her dogs had to offer. But now it was clear that he had been wrong. "That's unbelievable," Mike said quietly, shaking his head in disbelief. "I didn't think they could do it. I guess I've learned my lesson." The tension in the air was palpable as the bikers stood in stunned silence, still trying to process what they had just witnessed. Mike, the leader of the group, was the first to speak, though his voice was quieter now, laced with admiration instead of mockery. He glanced at his fellow bikers, who were equally stunned by Sarah's calm confidence and the impressive strength of her dogs. "Well," Mike said, breaking the silence, "I didn't expect that. I guess we've been completely outclassed here." For the first time since the challenge had begun, the bikers were no longer laughing or joking. They had come in thinking they were going to teach Sarah and her dogs a lesson, but instead, they were the ones learning. They had expected a quick victory, but the truth was, they hadn't even come close to beating Sarah and her canines. Sarah, however, didn't gloat or rub it in. She stood tall, calm, and composed, but there was a sense of quiet pride in her eyes. She knew that Max and Diesel were capable of amazing things, but she had never needed to prove it to anyone. It was enough that she and her dogs understood their worth. "You were expecting something else, weren't you?" Sarah said, her voice steady but with a hint of amusement. "But I told you, my dogs are trained for everything. They're not just for show. They're warriors." Mike nodded slowly, looking at Sarah with new respect. "I can see that now. I've learned more than I expected today." The other bikers, who had been watching in disbelief, began to approach Sarah, their attitudes shifting from mockery to curiosity. They were no longer interested in challenging her. Instead, they were eager to learn about the bond she shared with her dogs and the training that had made them so skilled. One of the bikers, a younger man who had been watching quietly from the sidelines, spoke up. "I'd always thought dogs were just pets, you know. But seeing how they work with you, how they listen to your every command, it's like they're on a different level. I had no idea." Sarah smiled slightly, appreciating the young man's change of heart. "That's because they're more than pets," she replied. "They're partners. They've been trained to understand me, to trust me, and to work with me no matter what. That's the key to everything we do." The group of bikers nodded, processing her words. Sarah could see the respect growing in their eyes. They had underestimated her, but now they understood that her dogs were far more than what they had assumed. They had been trained to protect, to assist, and to work under the most challenging circumstances. Mike, still looking a little humbled, took a deep breath. "You know, I didn't think much of this whole thing at first. I thought it was just a show, something to pass the time. But now, I get it. You're not just out here with some dogs. You've got a team, something real." Sarah nodded, her eyes softening. "That's right. Max and Diesel, they're my team. We don't need anyone else to prove that. We're a family." and we've got each other's backs." The bikers who had initially mocked Sarah and her dogs now stood in awe. They had come here thinking they were the ones who were in control, but they had learned an important lesson about respect and strength. It wasn't about how big or tough you appeared on the outside. It was about the connection you had with the people and animals you trusted. "Thanks for showing us what real strength looks like," Mike said, his voice sincere. "I think we've all learned a thing or two today." Sarah smiled, nodding in acknowledgement. "You're welcome. But it's not just about strength. It's about trust and loyalty. That's what makes us strong, and that's what makes us a team." As the bikers slowly gathered their things and prepared to leave, they took one last look at Sarah and her dogs. They had come in as strangers, mocking and doubting, but now they left with a newfound understanding. They had seen the strength of the bond between Sarah and her dogs, and they knew that it was something special, something they couldn't easily break or challenge. As Sarah watched them leave, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She hadn't needed to fight them or prove anything. Her dogs had done that for her. All that mattered now was that she and her dogs were together, stronger than ever, and ready for whatever came next. She turned to Max and Diesel, who were already at her side, their tails wagging slightly in contentment. The day had been long, but it had been worth it. Sarah knew that as long as she had her dogs, there was no challenge too great for them to face together. As the bikers slowly gathered their things and prepared to leave, the air around them was different than when they had arrived. They were no longer the loud, boastful group that had thought it would be easy to show up and mock Sarah and her dogs. Instead, they were quietly reflecting on what they had just witnessed. The tension that had been thick with competition earlier had shifted to a quiet mutual respect. Mike, the leader, was the first to break the silence. He had been one of the loudest when they first started their challenge, but now his tone was calm, almost thoughtful. "You know, Sarah, I came here thinking we could prove something today, but I think we ended up learning a lot more than we expected." Sarah, who had been standing quietly, watching the bikers pack up, gave him a small smile. "That's how it usually goes. Sometimes it takes a bit of a challenge to show people what's really important." Mike nodded slowly. "Yeah, I can see that now. At first, I thought you and your dogs were just another thing to make fun of. But after watching how you all work together, I can see that there's a lot more to you than meets the eye." The other bikers nodded in agreement, their expressions softening as they thought about the day's events. They had watched Sarah and her dogs handle every challenge with grace, strength, and a deep bond that was undeniable. They had expected to find weakness, but instead they had found something much stronger than they had anticipated. Sarah's dogs, Max and Diesel, were now lying on the ground near her feet, relaxed after the intense challenges they had just faced. They had proven their strength and skill in ways that had left the bikers speechless. But Sarah knew that it wasn't just about showing off. They had done it because they trusted each other, and that trust had gotten them through every obstacle. "You've got something special," one of the younger bikers said, his voice full of admiration. "I've seen a lot of things in my life, but I've never seen a team like that. You've got a bond with those dogs that's unbreakable." Sarah looked down at Max and Diesel, her heart swelling with pride. "It's not just about training," she said softly. "It's about understanding each other. They trust me, and I trust them. We've been through a lot together, and that's what makes us a team." Mike, still looking thoughtful, finally spoke again. "I guess we all thought strength was about size, power, and showing off. But today, you showed us that real strength is about loyalty and trust. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You and your dogs already proved everything." Sarah nodded, grateful for his words. She had never needed to prove herself to anyone. Her bond with Max and Diesel was the strongest proof of her abilities. They had worked together through countless challenges, and their teamwork had always been what got them through. It wasn't about proving something to others. It was about knowing that they could rely on each other, no matter what. The group of bikers packed up their bikes and gear, each one taking a moment to reflect on the lessons they had learned that day. There was no more mockery in their eyes, no more doubt. Instead, there was a deep respect for Sarah and her dogs, something that none of them had expected when they first saw her walking down the street. "Thanks, Sarah," Mike said finally, his voice sincere. "I didn't think I'd ever say this, but you and your dogs have earned my respect. You've taught me something today." Sarah smiled, looking at each of the bikers. "It's not about earning respect," she said. "It's about earning trust. Once you have that, everything else falls into place." The bikers nodded, taking in her words. They had learned more than they had expected, not just about Sarah and her dogs, but about what it meant to truly understand strength and teamwork. As they started their motorcycles and revved the engines, they glanced at Sarah and her dogs one last time. They weren't just leaving behind a challenge. They were leaving with a new perspective. They had come in thinking they would prove something, but instead, they had learned that real strength wasn't always what you could see on the outside. It was something much deeper, built on trust, loyalty, and a bond that couldn't be easily broken. Sarah watched as they rode off, her dogs by her side. She didn't need their approval. She knew what she had accomplished. And as the sound of the engines faded into the distance, she felt a sense of peace. Her dogs had shown their strength, and the bikers had learned a lesson. Max and Diesel looked up at her, their eyes shining with trust and affection. She patted both of their heads gently. "We make a great team, don't we?" The sound of the motorcycles faded as the bikers rode off into the distance, leaving Sarah and her dogs alone once again. The peaceful calm that followed was a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the air earlier in the day. Sarah stood there for a moment, watching the last of the bikers disappear down the road, her dogs by her side. Max and Diesel, their heads held high, looked up at Sarah, as if checking in with her. They had just gone through a long day of challenges, but now they were relaxed, their energy slowly returning to normal. Sarah reached down to give each of them a gentle pat on the head. "You did well today," she whispered, her voice soft and full of pride. "You always do." Max wagged his tail, his ears flicking back in contentment. Diesel, the Malinois, nuzzled Sarah's hand, as if she understood the words more than anyone else. It was a bond they shared that went beyond training and commands. It was a deep, unspoken connection built on trust, respect, and years of working side by side. As Sarah stood there, taking in the quiet surroundings, she couldn't help but think about the bikers. She had come into the day expecting nothing more than to walk past them, maybe get a few teasing comments, and move on. But instead, they had challenged her and her dogs, testing them in ways they hadn't expected. And in the end, they had learned something important, not just about Sarah and her canines, but about themselves. She had seen their attitude change over the course of the day, from mockery to respect. They had come in thinking that their size and strength would be enough to intimidate her, but they had left with a deeper understanding of what true strength meant. It wasn't about physical power or bravado. It was about loyalty, trust, and working together as a team. The dogs had proven that time and time again, and Sarah knew that it wasn't just the bikers who had learned a lesson. She had learned something too. While the bikers had tested her dogs, Sarah realized she had also tested herself. It had been easy to brush off their mocking at first, but as the challenges grew tougher, she found herself having to rely on more than just her dog's abilities. She had needed to remain calm under pressure, to trust in her training, and to believe in the strength of the bond she shared with Max and Diesel. And in doing so, she had proven to herself that there was nothing she couldn't handle. "Let's head home," Sarah said quietly, her voice a soft command. Max and Diesel perked up, ready to follow her. The day had been long, but it had been rewarding. She didn't need the approval of the bikers to know that she and her dogs had proven what they were capable of. They had faced every challenge with grace and determination, showing that strength came from within, and that trust in each other was what made them truly powerful. As they began walking down the street, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. She didn't need to keep proving herself to others. Her dogs knew what she was capable of, and that was enough. They had done their job, and now it was time to return home and rest. Sarah's mind wandered to the future. There would be more challenges ahead, more people who would underestimate her and her dogs. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that she had Max and Diesel by her side, and together there was nothing they couldn't face. They were a team, and that was the most powerful thing they could be. As they walked, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the streets. Sarah felt a quiet contentment wash over her. Today had been a reminder that real strength wasn't about showing off or proving something to others. It was about understanding your own worth and having the confidence to stand by it. It was about trusting the team you had built, whether it was your dogs, your friends, or even yourself. And with that, Sarah knew that the world would never truly understand the bond she shared with Max and Diesel, but that was all right. As long as they understood each other, that was all that mattered.